Well, my response is Burke. Edmund Burke. I believe he's much admired by Peter Hitchens. He represents a sort of conservative strand in thought, going back some time. And I've got a few quotes from him which I think are relevant, which I hope can perhaps bridge what may otherwise be thought to be an unbridgeable gap between our positions. So Burke wrote, "Under the pressure of the cares and sorrows of our mortal condition, men have at all times and in all countries called in some physical aid to their moral consolations: wine, beer, opium, brandy or tobacco." And he also mentions that alcohol in particular is a medicine for the soul. I take this as true. I'm not relying on Burke for this. Other people, Ronald K. Siegel has written a book about this, Intoxication, the Universal Drive. But it's certainly true that in all societies people have used one drug or another. And we see in children the desire to become dizzy. We see in monks the desire to fast and meditate. We see mind alteration in every society, at every level of every society. So I question whether it's either entirely desirable or, perhaps more importantly, possible to stamp it out completely. Now, of course, there are drugs and drugs, you may say. Peter, I guess I call you Peter.
Feel free.
Okay, Peter. Peter mentioned caffeine, and of course that's fine. But how do you know? As you say to these people, putting them in a rather tricky position, how do you know it hasn't done anything to you? In fact, there are studies which suggest that it is associated with psychosis, but actually very few studies have been done on this, and they tend to have caveats saying, but of course this is only correlation, it's probably just a cluster of factors, we can't really be sure. These are the kind of things we haven't seen in studies, more recent studies, but we haven't seen emphasised so much by the likes of Robin Murray, who I think is Peter's favourite scientist in this area. So there are different drugs. The established drug in this country that's mind-altering, that's definitely, clearly mind-altering, is alcohol. And that's embedded in the culture. Peter has a whole range of reasons why that should be treated differently from cannabis. It's been used for thousands of years, it's embedded in the culture. Actually, that's pretty much it. Variations on that. I'm sure he'll correct me if
Yes, I will.
if he disagrees, which I'm sure he does. So, I mean, my question is one which arises in the film With Now and I. Why trust one drug and not the other? I don't think you can really identify a dimension along which cannabis is clearly worse than alcohol. Alcohol is more damaging to health, I think everyone agrees. And I could go through comparisons on pretty much every dimension you care to mention. Now, that's often confused for whataboutery, that is, changing the subject basically to something else. But my point is not just to divert attention from cannabis. The point is either both of these things, taking both of these things are wrong, or taking neither of them is wrong. And I take the path that neither of them is wrong, in moderation. It would be unfair to compare Peter's evening glass of wine with somebody who's smoking 16 bongs or whatever, or huge amounts of cannabis in the park when they should be at school. Comparing like with like, any drug can be abused, and it has to be, if it is going to be abused, or if people are going to excessively depend on it, or in other ways, fixate on it, in the same way that people might fixate on, say, computer games or pretty much anything else, then that can slip over into what we might call pathological behaviour and have to be dealt with. But sensibly and moderately used cannabis and alcohol is definitely not better. Now, I think Peter suggested that he'd like to see both of them eliminated. But in fact, the recommendations he has and the policies that he approves in the case of alcohol don't amount to criminalisation. I think reverting to pre-First World War licensing laws is considered good enough. And similarly with cigarettes, health warnings, social obloquy, enough to gradually drive out this bad choice from society without having to bang people up. So, alcohol and cannabis. Reagan, I think, said, people say to me, your generation had martinis as a crutch, why can't we have our crutch? And his response was, well, how about this? Why don't you be the first generation that doesn't need a crutch? Which, I mean, that's easy for him to say. Which brings me to my next Burke quote. Hypocrisy, of course, delights in the most sublime speculations, for never intending to go beyond speculation, it costs nothing to have it magnificent. This obviously applies, I think, in the Reagan case. He's quite happy to suggest that other people should be the first generation not to have a crutch. But I think it also applies in Peter Hitchens' case, really. He's suggesting that effectively we could eliminate the use of cannabis from society by making the penalties sufficiently severe. But the question is, how severe do they have to be to achieve this utopian vision? And I think they would have to be insanely severe. And also we'd have to increase the probability of people actually being caught. They're obviously criminologists, penologists specifically, study the idea of general deterrence, which Peter appeals to. And it's not quite as simple as you might think. The idea is you do some sort of cost-benefit analysis. How likely am I to get caught? How bad is the outcome going to be if I am? Balance that against the presumably more or less certain outcome of how good it is to have a smoke or a drink or whatever, and then decide how to proceed. Well, people don't do that, and especially not the most vulnerable people, these children that Peter wants to protect. They definitely don't do that. So we are talking, in order to protect them from the health risks, we're talking about, I'm not quite sure, I think Peter suggested second offence, a year in prison, but a prison that's properly harsh, not like the holiday camp type of prison that we have at the moment. And a second offence, I think maybe 2 years. I don't know if it proceeds with an extra year on each subsequent offence. I mean, that would certainly remove people from society. I mean, it wouldn't even actually prevent them from taking cannabis, but I think it would interfere with their A-levels. So I'm not really convinced that that's the way to go. I mean, especially when you actually look at a comparison of different drug regimes. For instance, in America, they have high cannabis use, high incarceration. I mean, Americans have high incarceration for absolutely everything. They have judges that are bribed by people who build prisons to send children to prison. So maybe that's not a good example. There's Sweden, whose incarceration, well, they use a strange combination of extreme social orthodoxy. Sweden's a whole weird kettle of fish. They're sort of vodka belt place. They have a pathological way of drinking, and that seems to carry over to drugs. And they had a huge problem with injected amphetamine. The war on drugs there really is a sort of article of faith. Sweden is very odd. They had something called the hash book, which was basically full of made-up stuff, masquerade, very much like the sort of Politburo reference we had earlier. They had this thing called a hash book, which was given to children in schools, which was basically full of made-up fake science. I think in about 96, the government, which is largely being driven by public opinion, in quotes, which is mostly these large pressure groups, which are also, I can't really go into all that, it's very weird. There's a bloke called Tim Buchhout von Schollinger, who's written a book about the Swedish drug control system, which is very well researched and seems quite authoritative, and it's quite an interesting story in itself. But the key thing is that once this hash book, once the government had got fed up with having what are basically made-up stuff being taught to children as propaganda in this hash book, and said, actually, this stuff has to refer to real science, the declared rate of cannabis use has gone up since then, I think, from 1% to, I think it's now about 7% at the last count, according to the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs, which I think probably suggests actually that a lot of this was due to social pressure, and in this case a rather illicit form of sort of social conditioning and indoctrination. Not very much to do with the threat. And in the UK, when the dreaded cannabis warnings came in, I can't remember exactly what year it was about 6 years ago or something like that, I think. If you look at the latest report from the European Monitoring Centre, there's a precipitous fall in the rate of cannabis taking. I mean, you can argue about the methods of gathering this, but it's gone down from, I think it was about 20%. This is in the last month for people between 19 and 30, no, between 15 and 34, I think. Went down from about 20%, and it's now at about 12%. In the same report, there's a graph which shows quite a few countries changed their laws recently, and it shows graphs of cannabis use before and after the law. It's spaghetti. There's no relationship. What we do know is that people are going to take one drug or another. And cannabis, as drugs go, is not a bad one. I mean, it has its pros and cons. I favour a sort of balanced diet myself, and a balanced diet of different people taking different drugs. I mean, Peter's quite up on the idea that cannabis is going to sort of sap motivation or ruin the national character and make us all compliant. I mean, I think there are different drugs do have different effects. I don't think cannabis can be accused really of making people more compliant. The war on drugs was started by Nixon in response to the radical protesters. He wanted to get them, and he started the war on drugs. I mean, under the name war on drugs, it was going on before then with drug hysteria. So, the moral question just seems to me strange. If you accept that having a cup of hot toddy in bed at night, as Peter Geach, that's the case that Peter Geach, the eminent moralist, uses, if you accept that that's okay, then having a modest spliff when you've had a hard day at work at home, how can that be any worse? We've got all this stuff about distorting your senses, and maybe it makes a difference if you believe that they've been given to you by another being. I don't know. I mean, I think alcohol use is pretty standard amongst Christians, for example. I mean, I just don't buy that. And it's nothing to do with being sovereign over the body. It's not a libertarian sort of adolescent morality by numbers from first principles sort of thing. It's just a question of liberty and proportion. What we've seen is, I think, what Peter really ends up relying on is fear of the supposed ill effects using children and schizophrenia. And I'll just finish with my last quote from Burke. No passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear.